for showing up here today. We got 34 participants and probably more than that because sometimes some people there's more than one person there, so that's a good start. Before we get into Elizabeth will introduce our speakers shortly. Before we do that, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Dave Willer. I'm the president of the Historical Society of St. Catharines. This is our second virtual lecture. Before getting to that, just want to say a couple of introductory announcements very briefly. First of all, our new web page is up. We've been talking about it, so I do encourage everyone to go see the new web page. We'll keep working on it, but it's certainly a lot better than it was. It looks a lot better than it was even just a few weeks ago. So please take a look at that. The other thing too is for members who got the last newsletter, you'll see there's the membership form to sign on as a member for the 2021 year. And also for those who just look at the website, you can also see the membership brochure in the website for you to become a member. So please, we do need to keep our members active and keep the list growing to get our membership fees. So, please, if you're interested to sign on to that. Just a question here. I think someone was asking about the website. I just Googled Historical Society of St. Catharines. It just came up. I just don't have the exact, I think it might be St. Catharines history.wordpress.com. That's what's showing up on my iPad here. But anyways, yeah, if you could all take a look at that, that'd be much appreciated. So I think on that basis, we can get started with our presentation. When it's done, I'll just say a few words. I think that's pretty much everything I have to say is now here. So why don't we start with our presentation. To begin that, we can start with our introduction.
Okay, that would be me. Now, Howard, are you still there?
I'm still here.
Oh, good. I just want to make sure I didn't lose anyone in my great kerfuffle. Anyway, good evening, everyone. If I haven't already said that, it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest speaker, Dr. Howard Slepkov. Howard was born and raised in St. Catharines. After graduating from high school, he spent a year in Israel participating in a youth leadership program. On his return to Canada, he attended McMaster University, where he completed a BA in psychology and an MA in political sociology. He started into a PhD program at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, then returned to St. Catharines, where he taught every grade in the public elementary school system. He then became a consultant for teachers and students in the new digital technologies. New back then they were, I guess. Following that career, Howard entered the new doctoral program in education at Brock University. After earning his PhD, he worked with teachers in training for Niagara University, which was opening a new campus in Toronto. Following a successful 8-year career in post-secondary education, Howard retired and began work on his book, A Future in Doubt, which reflects his life of involvement with the local synagogue and the Jewish community. The book was published in 2020 and is available on Amazon or from the author. Howard has requested that we all save any questions or comments until after his presentation, which will take about 30 minutes. I think that's all I have to say here. Please welcome Dr. Howard Slepkov.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So let me just get started here. My presentation is actually comprised of about 30 minutes of slides at approximately 45 seconds each. I will narrate along the way, and what I'm going to try to do is explain where the book came from and the inspiration for it, and then fittingly begin with how Judaism differs from other religious groups and why the synagogue is so central to our identity. So without any further ado, I'm going to run my show. So A future in doubt, the rise and actually it's the probable demise of one small Jewish community and what it says about the future of synagogues everywhere. And the design for the cover is partially because of a sketch that many of you who know Julie Snyder will be aware of her work. And Julie gave me permission to use that sketch. And I had my printer in Victoria design the concept of a tree, because our identity as Jews very much stems from the synagogue. And in my book, I've tried to explain how the synagogue is central to our identity, how its establishment in St. Catharines helped to grow the community, and why the future is in doubt today, because there aren't as many young people who see the synagogue as central to their identity. It's all about identity and how it's defined. So in my book, I have a series of chapters, and what I have tried to do is walk the reader through what it means to have a synagogue in a community, how that synagogue came to be in St. Catharines, and how it's changed over almost 100 years. My book actually focuses on the early quarter of the 20th century, because that's when the community began to consolidate. And as you can see, I have appendices at the end about the different families and when they arrived, and then how the families are related. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a couple of minutes. As was explained, the book is available on Amazon, and I'm waiting for the second printing to arrive. So what I've tried to do is I'm trying to use the synagogue as a focus of how this community evolved, what it took for a group of fewer than 30 families to create the synagogue that we have today, and the efforts that went into keeping that synagogue alive and vital, and it still is. At the very beginning of my book, I have a foreword, which I added at the end, and with the pandemic, we know there are more and more families that are moving out of the GTA, and I hope that maybe our fortunes will be reversed. So the story of the synagogue begins with Moses and the giving of the Ten Commandments. We just read today in the Torah the week's portion, which deals with what happened immediately after the Exodus. And first, the Exodus was the beginning of our foundation as a nation, and then the giving of the Ten Commandments, the foundation of our religious principles. And many people don't realize that they evolved in tandem. So after Sinai, Moses was commanded to build a Mishkan, a temple for the tablets and the Holy Ark. And that's the pictogram of what that looked like in the camp while the children of Israel wandered for 40 years in the desert. While they were wandering, the nationhood of the Jewish people and the peoplehood of those people, of those families that left Egypt, merged with what became our religious foundation. The second temple, which you see in front of you, was in Jerusalem. And our faith dictated 2,000 years ago that we sacrifice at the altar in the second temple. It was actually at that second temple that Jesus Christ came to Jerusalem to observe the Passover. Unfortunately, the temple was not able to withstand, the temple and the state at the time around the temple was not able to support the religious needs of the Jews, the children of Israel, who no longer could live in Jerusalem. So it's at that time of the Second Temple, before the birth of Jesus Christ, that we begin to see synagogues around in what we still refer to as the Near East, at a distance from Jerusalem, where there was not a place to sacrifice, but there was a place to worship and to congregate and to meet and be with other people in the community. And it is at that time that the synagogue began to coalesce as the center of the Jewish community. There are magnificent ruins all through the state of Israel, into Jordan, into Egypt, into Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, that show just how dispersed the Jewish people were. They were farmers and herdsmen, and they only came to Jerusalem for the harvest festivals, one of which was the Passover, which was why Jesus went to Jerusalem at the time of what would end up being his crucifixion. In 70 AD, the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans. And it was essentially because the Roman Empire was not prepared to allow the independence of action on the part of the children of Israel, now referred to as the Jews, to live apart from and observe and worship as they wanted to. When the Second Temple was destroyed, the people in and around the area of Jerusalem were dispersed. They went all over the known world, which was, of course, the Roman Empire. And wherever they went, they established synagogues. They could no longer sacrifice, so in place of the sacrifices, the rabbis began to evolve what we refer to as Rabbinic Judaism, which centered on prayer, and that had to take place in the synagogue. We have certain prayers that we are only able to say when we have 10 men. 10 men in those days. It's now changed. We're much more egalitarian. But the synagogue became the focus of the Jewish life wherever Jews found themselves. Sadly, wherever they found themselves, no sooner were they established than they were expelled. The first expulsion was in 1492 from Spain, and the Jews in Spain traveled into Central Europe, and then one by one, the countries of Europe expelled the Jews because of the belief that Jews were the killers of Christ, and because they believed that they undermined the authority of the crown. And so the Jewish people dispersed all over Europe. They found a home, not necessarily hospitable, but in Eastern Europe, which is where the vast majority of Jews found themselves, in the Russian Empire. And what you see is a very common sight in a Jewish community at what became known as the Pale of Settlement, that area that involved Poland and Belarus, White Russia, which is Ukraine, and the Russian Empire. Anti-Semitism followed the Jews wherever they were. And so they were forced to live apart and protect their way of life. But because they weren't allowed to participate in the wider world, in the wider economy, the strength of the Jewish world continued on. We defined ourselves as Jews. We weren't Russians, we weren't Poles, we weren't Germans, we weren't Ukrainians, we were Jews. We defined ourselves that way, and the countries that we found where we were living defined us that way. And the Russian Empire sought to eliminate the strength of the Jewish communities. And so we underwent a series of pogroms, which meant that the Jewish community was attacked, killed, and made to feel unwelcome. And so the Jews, as part of the evolution of the world at the end of the 19th century, began to leave Europe for the shores where they were thought that they were going to the Golden Medina. They thought the streets of America were paved with gold. And the Jews went to America, to Canada, to South Africa, to Latin America, and to many of the countries in Africa itself, and even in Asia. But the vast majority of Jews went to the United States. They all settled in places like the Lower East Side. They weren't welcome by the larger society. They lived together, they became peddlers, they eked out a living. You had families that lived 4 and 5 and 6 families in one dwelling, and everybody contributed to the economy. Needless to say, it was all about making a living and finding a place to make a living. At the time, the United States and Canada and all of the other countries where people congregated were industrializing. And so the Jews left New York, Halifax, Montreal, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and they moved inland. And there is a book written by Chassia Diner that explains how the peddler settled America. The Jews in the Eastern Seaboard, both in Canada and the United States, went inland, carrying their goods and looking for a place where they could make a living. And they became peddlers. And if they made a bit of a living, then they invited the other members of their family to join them. They made a little bit more money, and so they brought more people from the old country. Why did they come to St. Catharines? How did the Jews end up in St. Catharines? Well, because at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, St. Catharines was actually a booming community. We had the shipbuilding because of the proximity to Lake Ontario, and the part that in St. Catharines followed the Welland Ship Canal. There was tanneries. There was, and in my next slide, I'll just wait for that for a moment. I'm a little bit ahead of myself now. The Rio, one of the first cars built in North America, actually began in Canada. And because the automobile industry represented a change from one form of transportation to another form of transportation, it meant that people who were looking for work could, as they said in Yiddish, machte Geschäfte, they could make a living. They could support their families. So the Rio, because it was the automobile industry was thriving before the First World War. That was another reason why some people, peddlers first, came to St. Catharines. Of course, we also had the market economy based on agriculture. And St. Catharines was an agricultural center for the Niagara Peninsula. And so somebody who came into Montreal from the old world, they made their way to Toronto because the Jews in Montreal were established and looked down their noses at the poor Poles that came from Europe. And then they came to Toronto, and then they found out, somebody said down the road in St. Catharines, you could make a living. And so that's where the first merchants, and others began to come to St. Catharines. That's what the end of St. Catharines looked like, looking down towards where my grandfather's store was, down towards Queenston Street and beyond. In my book, I have one of my appendices shows when the various Jewish families came to St. Catharines and where they ended up. And along this stretch and along the stretch in the next picture at the end of St. Paul Street at what became known as the junction where Eastchester and Geneva and Queenston and so on and St. Paul Street met, that's where the Jews congregated. They had their stores oftentimes at one end of the St. Paul Street, and they lived down Queenston Street, closer to where the synagogue was going to find itself. But they would be moving back and forth. They'd move from the end of St. Paul Street to the top of St. Paul Street. They'd move in with one family, and then they'd be moving in with another. But it's not much that different from what other immigrant groups found when they came to a place like St. Catharines. So one of the earliest merchants by the name of Rachmiel Nadel lived on Queenston Street, and that's some of the housing on Queenston Street, where the Jewish families, the better-to-do Jewish families lived. And in 1902, in the next slide, you'll see a picture of Rachmiel Nadel. In English, he called himself Richard. Rachmiel Nadel was actually related to a merchant who had already lived in St. Catharines. And in 1902, he decided that he had a son who he wanted to have a bar mitzvah for. And up until that point, he'd been going to Hamilton, to where there was a more established Jewish community, so that his son could learn how to read Hebrew and prepare himself for the traditional bar mitzvah that Jewish boys have when they turn 13. And Rachmiel Nadel decided, no, we are getting to be a big enough community. We need to have our own minyan. And I'm going to stop here for a minute. I'm going to try anyways and explain. Just 1 second. Let me, I need to figure out how to stop for a minute. I think I've stopped. In Judaism, in order to observe some of the things that we're required to, you need to have 10 men. To have a bar mitzvah, you need to read the Torah. To read the Torah, you need to have 10 men. Jews needed to have kosher food, and they needed to have a supply of that kosher food. So for all of those reasons, in 1902, Rachmiel Nadel, let me just get back to that slide. Rachmiel Nadel decided okay, sorry, let me. Sorry, technical difficulty, let me just. Where there's a will, there's a way. So Rachmiel Nadel, I think I'm working now. Yeah. So Rachmiel Nadel gathered around him a number of other Jewish families that were already living in St. Catharines. And they, by 1914, there were other families that were coming because the new channel of the Welland-Ship Canal was going to be built. So they knew that they were going to have growth in the community. And they decided that they needed to become Congregation B'nai Israel. So in 1919, they became Congregation B'nai Israel. And one of the founding families in the screen capture in front of you is the Morris family. Rachmiel Nadel's daughter, Tilly, married another peddler who settled in St. Catharines, who was Morris. And they had all of those children. There were several daughters and more than a few sons. By 1902 as well, they needed a teacher. So they went looking for somebody, and that somebody was Jacob Cooperman, who you just saw in that slide. And I'll come back to him in a minute. But Jacob Cooperman came to St. Catharines by 1902 as well to teach. And when the congregation got big enough, it stopped during the war years and First World War. When it got big enough, they decided they could no longer hold services in that little house that you see in front of you. That house, which by the way was just torn down a couple of weeks ago because it had deteriorated so badly. It was on the corner where the synagogue, you see that on the left of that picture, where the synagogue was. They began to plan for the synagogue, and they moved the house back. But in order to buy the land, Jacob Cooperman had to go to a non-Jewish friend because the family that owned the land would not sell to Jews. So Jacob Cooperman, who by this time had already become very successful, he had a friend buy the land, and then the friend turned around and sold the land to the synagogue. The house was moved back, and they began to work on the synagogue. One of the founding families was the Abe the Newman family. Abe Newman, because a number of people asked how some of the families came here. Abe Newman, the eldest of the Newman family, stopped on his way from Russia to Texas, where he wanted to become a beef baron. He wanted to be a rancher. Don't know how he figured that out, but he stopped in St. Catharines because his aunt was one of the Austins, and he never left. He became a scrap dealer. He had 5 children. He had come with his wife. My grandfather, pictured in that there, came around 1920. He had a cousin that told him about a business that was for sale that was on King Street. He bought that business and relocated it to St. Paul Street, 126 St. Paul Street, and that was at one time called the Fashion Cloak and Fur. So there were beginning to be a nucleus of families who could think about building a synagogue. They needed the synagogue because they still were not welcome in the community. They needed a source of kosher food. They needed a place where they could have services. They needed a place where they could teach and so on. So local architect designed the synagogue. You see it there. That is very much the way it looks, except for the dome. The domes were removed in the 1960s because a rabbi that we had at the time didn't think the domes fit with the Eastern European Jewish way of living. So they were taken off. But other than that, the synagogue stayed the same. To the left of that is where the Jewish Community Center went, but that's beyond the part of the story that I'm talking about. In that picture, that's the laying of the cornerstone in 1923, and that's R.J. Hoffman. Ralph Jacob Hoffman and his wife, Julia. Ralph Hoffman ended up with a department store on St. Paul Street. His name is above the building when you come to the end of James Street and get ready to turn into St. Paul Street, left or right. The Hoffman building is right there. He employed a lot of the new Jewish immigrants at one time or another, and he became very successful. He was part of the building process. The small number of families that we had in St. Catharines at the time, imagine they put up that structure. There were fewer than 30 families. They were doing their best to make a living, to raise their families. By 1930, we had the Depression, and they had to move mountains in order to raise the money and support the upkeep of the synagogue. That's taken in the armories, and I know my grandmother is in the back on the far left side. They were obviously raising money for the state, for the foundation in Israel, for the growing state of Israel. In 1952, the bima at the back here, I'm going to put it on pause for a minute. This part is where the Torah scrolls are kept. That was in the middle here, and the people were all the way around the outside. And in 1948, this picture was taken in 1947. All of those men are the Jews who grew up in St. Catharines, who received rings. The Canadian government had a project, and each of those men received a ring for their service, marking their service. And many of them wore those rings until the day they died, my father included. But the bima, the dais, we refer to it as the bima, was moved back. Other than that, it looks the same inside. We went from a community of approximately 40 families to a height of almost 175 families, and now we're down to 135 families. And that the word family means is a constituent idea. They could be singles, spinsters, widows, widowers, however you want to define it. That's the way the sanctuary looks now on the inside. We haven't been inside that sanctuary for almost a year now, and many of us miss it terribly, but it still is the focus of our community. And I'm going to end now. There's another couple of slides. The only other major thrust that I was asked about was the building of the cemetery. Before the early 50s, all the Jewish families who lost their loved ones were buried in the cemeteries in Hamilton. But in 1952, my grandfather took the lead, and he had a friend in City Hall, and he went and they bought a parcel of land from Victoria Lawn. And they developed that into the cemetery. The picture that you see right there is not very clear, but that was a runway for one of the channels of the Welland-Ship Canal, because when we opened up that section of the cemetery, that's about 1/4 of what we have actually. When we fixed up that part so that we could use it to bury people, we came across the original foundation stones from the Welland-Ship Canal. Then after they established the cemetery, the only other thing they needed was a chapel. My grandfather befriended a man by the name of Philip Cooperman when he came to St. Catharines. And Philip Cooperman went to my grandfather. My grandfather signed for him at the bank, and Phil Cooperman built the Leonard Hotel, named after his son Leonard. And then, of course, they acquired the Queensway Hotel. Phil Cooperman died tragically before he was 50, massive stroke. And my grandfather asked the family to establish the Cooperman Memorial Chapel, which is what we use now sometimes when people want a graveside service for burial. We use the chapel. So that's how we got to about 1955. The rest of my book, I talk about all the things we did, all the things my parents and my grandparents did to secure a future, to make sure that their children and grandchildren had a strong Jewish identity, because it was only because of that identity that we were willing to support the synagogue. Somebody has to keep the doors open. Somebody has to pay the taxes. Somebody has to pay for the heat, and so on. And the book refers to a future in doubt because we don't know whether there will be a nucleus of families willing to keep our building open much longer. And now I've talked just about enough, a little bit longer, and I'm going to turn it back over to the chair, who will now, and I'll be glad to entertain questions. Thank you very much, by the way, for inviting me. Okay.
You're muted, Dave. There.
Yeah, no, I was just trying to get my screen up. So, John Brenton, before taking questions, that you have to unmute everyone, correct?
Or they can do it individually.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I can't tell.
People can unmute themselves, Dave.
I've
Okay.
unmuted myself.
Yeah.
Okay. So for asking questions then, to do this, there are people who've put their hands up manually, it seems. I can see it on my screen. So some cases I can start with that and just say the name based on whose hands are up on the screen, the virtual hand, so to speak. There's a question from Matthew.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, I can.
Okay, I've got two quick questions just to make sure I understood your presentation. So you're saying that the first Jews to arrive in St. Catharines arrived here in the early 1900s? And did any of those folks get employment at the Rio car manufacturing plant?
The Jews that came in the earliest, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, they actually came to support the industries. They became merchants, clothing merchants, shoemakers, boot makers. They were scrap dealers. Unfortunately, we just lost one of the founding families, Albert Adelstein, and his father came to St. Catharines because he was now all of a sudden I'm going to have a senior moment and forget. He was a
metallurgist.
I'll think of it in a minute, but he came because he was not a machinist. He came because he knew he could get work supporting the people and the businesses that were establishing. I'll think of what the word is that I want after. Sorry. But they didn't work in the factories. They supported the workers. They were part of the merchant class and the scrap dealers.
So they tried to be sort of self-employed business owners.
Oh, yes, they all were. They were all self-employed business owners. And one of the reasons why our community is suffering so much now, there are fewer and fewer self-employed small business people, and there are more and more professionals. And the professionals, the way of life of the professional and the academic is very different from the way of life of the merchant class. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
That's because everybody wanted their son to be a doctor or a lawyer.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. My father, I told John on Monday when we were testing this out, my father said that the day you want to take over the store is the day I'm going to take a gun to my head. He literally said over my dead body. I didn't become the doctor he wanted, but I didn't do so badly.
Howard, can you say a little more about the store, Fashion Cloak and Fur? I love the name of that. I remember it in the 50s and 60s, I think.
I can, Elizabeth. My grandfather bought the store and the name from a man by the name of Zalkin that moved to Hamilton. He probably was a little bit older and he'd done very well. My grandfather, when he first came to St. Catharines, he lived with Jacob and Anna Cooperman until he could establish himself and bring his family. My father was about 2 when they moved to St. Catharines. At one time, my grandfather sold everything, suits, coats, dresses, furs, you name it. And then in the 60s, my father realized that sportswear needed to be part of the business. And that was the part of the downfall of their partnership because my grandfather didn't like change and my dad did want change. So, but then in the 70s, the later part of the 70s, my parents closed up the store because the Penn Center was growing and there just wasn't the market on St. Paul Street.
Thanks. I sure remember it. Yeah. And that's a terrific picture in the photo of your grandfather.
Thank you.
1923.
Yep. I have it right behind me on the ledge.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm looking at a couple of hands. There's also a couple of written messages. Look at there's one virtual hand up from Karen Burt. Question. Okay, let's move on maybe then to a couple questions here that are shown on the chat. Some of them that can be answered quickly. Is one, you said you missed the synagogue. Is it closed? I guess this is COVID. What is it doing during COVID is maybe the question to ask.
Well, we have been, we closed up at the same time as everybody else closed up. I guess that was the middle of March. And by the beginning of April, we had started to have a service every week online. I lead the services every Thursday morning. We're supposed to have services. Of course, we're supposed to have services twice a day, 7 days a week. We don't do that. For a long time, we had services on Thursday morning and Saturday morning on the Shabbat, on the Sabbath. I lead the services on Thursday. We have a part-time rabbi. We have a service on a Saturday once a month, a complete service. We have a Torah study once a month on a separate Saturday, and we do other programs in between. So like so many other people, we're using Zoom to keep our community alive and thriving.
That's good. Next question, again, it was on the chat. It said, is there a synagogue in Niagara Falls, other synagogues in Niagara?
At the turn of the 20th century, when the St. Catharines Jewish community started to become larger, there were Jews and Jewish families living in almost every single part of the Niagara Peninsula. Camden, Smithville, Fort Erie, Port Colborne, Niagara Falls, Welland. Every little small town had a Jewish merchant or general store. Then there were synagogues in Welland, in Fort Erie, in Niagara Falls, in Beamsville, and in St. Catharines. And we're the only synagogue left open. Niagara Falls closed its synagogue and sold its building. They're in the process of moving whatever things they need to keep protected and don't want to give away or get rid of. They're all moving to our building, to our Jewish Community Center, because we have a museum kind of thing in our community, in our JCC.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it for the written questions. I should say there's it says, great, Howard, well done. So not a question, but a comment and a few other comments. Thank you for a good lecture.
Thank you. I see, I haven't taken the time to read them. Thank you. Yeah, I meant to say hello and shout out to all those people whose names I recognize. I won't say whose names I recognize, whose faces I recognize, but hi and thank you for putting up with my presentation.
Dave, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Howard. When I was reading your book,
Who's talking?
Thank you for the personal copy. I was very interested, because I'm not from St. Catharines, to note that a lot of the Jews lived on Water Street and in that area around Queenston, as you referred to it as the Junction. And I just found that I had no idea that Water Street was part of your community. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the merchants along St. Paul Street, some of the names that those of us might recognize?
Well, first of all, I can point out that there were Jewish families. It's in the appendix. There were Jewish families that lived all along Queenston Street from St. Paul Street to beyond where the synagogue was on Calvin Street, along Queenston Street, along Church Street, along Geneva Street, along North Street, and Water and Wiley and St. Patrick. The original families settled close to where the synagogue was, because you're not supposed to drive on the Sabbath. And you're not supposed to carry on the Sabbath. So people would live close to where the synagogue was. That's what they were used to in Europe. In terms of the families that had businesses, before the 50s, there were quite a few families. The Myers family, that would have been, that became Susan Miles. Judy Hirschberg, Judy Myers married Manny Hirschberg, and they had a store. The Herzogs had a huge men's clothing business at the end of St. Paul Street, right by Geneva Street. The Nash family, of course. I was going to point out that a lot of the families ended up in St. Catharines because they knew somebody else. We're not sure who told who, but the Tobes, the Ubermans, the Nashes, the Magders, the Cohens, the Slepkovs, they all came from within 100 kilometers of each other in Belarus. My grandmother came from Iași in Romania, and a number of the other families. The Harold Nash's family came from within 25 kilometers. And so they would come to Toronto, they would live with a member of the family, or what I referred to, I used in the book, the term Landsman, somebody who was from the same area of Europe where they came from. And then they would say, I know where there's a community and people are making a living. Nobody expected to make a big living, but all they expected was to be able to support their family. So they came to St. Catharines because they knew somebody. And then those people brought somebody else. A lot of people will be familiar with the Katzman name. The Katzman brothers, that would be Archie Katzman. They all came to St. Catharines because they were shoemakers. Then they expanded out. The Kaplan family, they were in the furniture business. They were at the end of St. Paul Street. At least Harry Kaplan was. And Itzy Kaplan was in his father's business. They were merchants. The DeVore family was here until after the war. They were in the furniture business. So they all were independent merchants, and many of them left because when they had raised their kids and their kids wanted to move, they moved to be close to their kids. And that's the way the community has evolved. There are all kinds of families that came after the war. Of course, the baby boomers, business just boomed. My parents, age mates, that generation, they're the only generation in history where every year their incomes went up. Business continued to get better from 1946 until the late 70s. They raised their families, they built their homes, they added to the synagogue, and now, of course, it's going the opposite way.
Thanks, Howard.
You're welcome.
There's another question on the chat, which I think you may have partially answered. It says, was there any post-World War II immigration to St. Catharines in the late 1940s or Russian Jews in the 1970s? I think to some extent you've answered that.
I could speak to the Russian Jews.
Sure. Well, actually, I want to speak to that. Yeah, absolutely. At
the end of the Second World War, we actually saw an influx not only of young families that were growing and looking for opportunities for business. I could go down the list. There must have been 24 families that came because they were going into business. But we also had some Holocaust survivors. They didn't talk about their experiences, but they came to St. Catharines in the late 1940s and into the 50s. And then, of course, when the Soviet Union opened up the doors and let the Jews leave, there were Soviet Jews that came to, Russian Jews that came to St. Catharines. Most of them didn't last very long because the Jews that came from Russia at the end of the 20th century or before, they were used to living in big cities. They did not want to live in small communities. They'd come from large cities in Russia and they wanted to live in large cities. It's exactly the same as our children. Our children, we raise them to go to school. They all went to school in big cities, in Halifax, in Toronto, in Vancouver, in Winnipeg, in Montreal. And we all know the attractions of life in the big city. And so, but we experienced a huge amount of growth. Brock University brought some professors, obviously, and some of them helped to grow the community. Not everybody, but some. It's like everybody else, like by the time we were middle-aged, the options in front of us were so completely different from what they were when we were growing up. Life is completely different today. There was no anti-Semitism. There's very little anti-Semitism today. You cannot underestimate what it meant to grow up in the 50s. And I pointed this out to John and he didn't know this. Until the mid-60s, there were no Jews that could belong to the St. Catharines Golf and Country Club, to the tennis club, to the lawn bowling club, to the St. Catharines Club. to Port Dalhousie Yacht Club. We weren't allowed to belong anywhere. And there were people who bought houses in the Queen Mary Fairs area, Woodruff area off of Ontario Street, that in the original deeds it said, this house cannot be sold to Armenians or Jews.
Yeah, I've seen some of those.
That's why the Jewish community was so strong. When I was 13 and I was invited to a birthday party that was being held, not to a birthday party, to a Christmas party that was held in the St. Catharines Golf and Country Club. My grandmother tore a strip off of me up and down. Your father can't golf there, your aunt can't golf there, but you're going to go to a Christmas party there? Paznit, she said in Yiddish. It's not good. It shouldn't happen. You shouldn't allow it. You shouldn't do it. Today, we don't think anything of any of those things.
No. Okay, thank you.
I saw a hand up from the Sigalovitzes.
Yeah. Hi, this is Jane.
I have a question, Howard.
Yes.
Joanne Atkinson here.
Joanne, sorry, I thought it was coming from another square. Hi, Joanne, and nice to see you.
Yes, I had a question. Back in the 60s, around 66 to 70.
When you were pledging for a sorority?
No, I was teaching at Oak Ridge School in the South End, and I had a good percentage of my class, grade 6, that were Jewish. And again, a lot of the families you talked about, the Goldbergs, Hirschbergs, Herzogs, Katzmans, I had some of all of them in that class those years. And exactly what you talked about. They were very strong academic students, very geared to doing well academically. And truly, many of them did go on. I sort of followed their history and have, moved to other professions and other communities. But I did remember, and that's what I was going to ask you about the property situation and getting to know the families, which I did quite well because I was there a few years. They mentioned that they couldn't buy property in so many areas. And so when the South End was opening up, across from that area by Brock now, that they were able to buy homes, get a brand new home and be able to establish themselves there, which they couldn't in most other areas. So consequently at that school, we had a large number of students, and it made for a very, I thought, a great education for all of us. We could celebrate and share when they were having Passover, and they could talk about their customs along with the other students in the class. So it was something that I don't know, you were saying, when did that end, those property issues regarding when did they actually stop doing that, where people were not allowed to buy because of the fact they were Jewish?
Well, those property restrictions only applied to the areas that were inhabited by the well-to-do money class in St. Catharines. There were not a lot of Jews that built homes on Hillcrest, but they were able to build homes on South Drive and on Highland Avenue. And there are some of us who can go up and down those streets and say, I remember when so-and-so lived here and so-and-so lived there and so-and-so lived there and so on. And since we're about the same age, I know what the period you're talking about. And when those families, when they sold the farms on the other side of the tracks, on the other side of the railroad tracks, I began grade 7 when Sir Winston Churchill was still public school and became a grade 7, 8, 9, 10. And then the farm areas, that's where they all built their new homes. They built bigger homes. And of course now that same trend has gone from big homes in the south of St. Catharines to big homes out in the country. And that's another reason why people just don't cross paths. They're not interested in the way of life of the Jews that live in the towns, in the cities. Their lives evolve around very different things. But we were very close in the 60s, very close.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, Joanne. Nice to see the two of you.
Hello.
Hopefully next time it'll be at a concert in the
Yes,
back.
that's what we're waiting for.
So yeah, that's good.
I know, so am I, so am I.
Hello, this was a wonderful presentation. This is Jane Segalowitz here.
Thank you, Jane. Hi, I saw your hand up before.
And what I just wanted to add was that all the names that you talked about, the Herzogs, the Katzmans, Magyar, Kaplan, I met all of those women. I knew all of those women as a little Polish girl growing up on Queenston Street. My mother and father had a hairdressing shop at 42 Queenston Street, which is just around the corner from the synagogue. And all of these women came to my mother, Mary Kroll, to get their hair done. It was Kroll's Beauty Salon. And so I used to sit there and just listen to the ladies talk, and I got to know all of those women. And as my mother got cancer later, and so she was unwell, and people knew it. And these women brought things for her, lemon curd and strudel, and they were so caring of her. And I just wanted to share that.
Well, that's part of that's where our culture differs from our religion, our sense of peoplehood. We believe that our peoplehood is supported by acts of loving kindness to each other. We prepare our own for burial. We bury our own. Everything centers around the needs of the Jewish community. And unfortunately, our kids and our grandkids don't really know what that means anymore because they live in a very different world. We grew up at a time when people supported one another. People put out a hand to help the neighbor, and that was a known world. We didn't think about, going overseas to travel. And if we did, we backpacked or hitchhiked. We didn't stay at first class hotels.
Yeah.
I had no idea that Sid married a local girl.
Yeah, local girl from Queenston Street.
And no idea.
And although her background's Polish Catholic, as far as I was concerned, she was Jewish.
What was that? I missed that.
As far as I was concerned, she's Jewish because, she knew the community.
Well, I also had the recipes. Those women shared their recipes with my mother. So I still have the recipe for honey cake from Mrs. Katzman, I think.
Well, my wife's family, that's a specialty, honey cake. So I've taken that over for the family. I make honey cake now.
Wave.
Oh, Elizabeth, yeah.
This is for Sid and Jane, especially. I think it was March 1st, 2020. It must have been one of the last times that anyone was in the synagogue, and you, Sid, did a concert.
March 2nd, yes.
March 2nd it was, and there we were. There were a lot. It was full of people in right in the synagogue. It was lovely.
And I remember when it was over and we're all milling around, there was enough word about the virus that we were sort of, do we hug each other or not? We weren't quite sure what to do.
There was hugging, there was plenty of food, and it was great.
Michael Kaczynski's piece that he played.
That's right, Michael Kaczynski had written a medley of klezmer tunes for us that we played.
It was lovely, and I think of it because it seemed like that was the last event anyone went to, really.
Well, we
finally unplugged the fridges and the freezer and emptied I was responsible for keeping the fridges and the freezer stocked because we always had a lunch on Saturday, and they were filled to the top because we had a number of events coming up, and I finally we divided it all up and cleaned it up. So it is what it is. God willing, by this time next year, we'll be able to close our eyes and imagine what life was like last year.
We're ready for another concert, so just let us know.
Yeah. Well, we're hoping for the fall. We're hoping to have a full season in the fall for the symphony. That's what I'm talking about. And we're hoping to be able to have our high holiday services in September in the sanctuary. That's a hope. I don't know whether it will come about, but we're keeping our fingers crossed.
Dave, is it about time for me to?
Yeah, I think so. I think that concludes it. So yeah, Gail.
Yeah, Dave. Okay, you're unmuted. Okay, there you are. Howard, that was an absolutely delightful presentation. For those of us that have your book, you went far beyond the book. It's quite a unique book. It's something that I don't think very many communities in Ontario or elsewhere have ever written about. I know one was written about the Jews of Brampton, but that's the only one I've been able to find. And I loved the photographs you showed, which aren't in the book. I mean, the photographs in the early part of your presentation, absolutely remarkable. I'm so glad you kept them all. And you know, for those of us who are not from St. Catharines, not born and raised here, it's just wonderful to know the history that you've told us about. I've always been interested in the synagogue and the cemetery and just the whole development, and also the covenants against Jews in various areas, including Olin Ridge, where I lived for 40 years. The covenants were there as well. So I can't thank you enough on behalf of the Society for all you've brought to us tonight. It's really a remarkable story. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gail. And I want to make sure people know that if you want a copy of my book, I'll be more than happy to sign it. And I'll be selling them for $35. And I inscribe them, and we can do our business at the front door with our masks on if we have to. Or you can order it from Amazon.
Yep. All right. Good. One more thing. I wanted to thank you for your acknowledgement to Frank Kaplan, a longtime friend of many of us, in the front of the book, because he was working so hard for so many years on trying to get this story out, and you've done it for him. So thank you for that too.
And thank you. It was my sincere disappointment that Frank didn't live to see the book in print. He no longer was able to, and I just received a card from Dina, his widow.
I hate technology.
I know. And I gave her a copy of the book, and she was just thrilled to see that Frank was acknowledged. Frank had that one final piece about the mortgage and the sale of the land, right, because he did his interviews at a time when a lot of the people were still alive. He interviewed Bernie Cooperman before he passed away. He interviewed Bernie's sister, Ida, who was married to a Katzman, before she passed away. So he had a lot of little details that I couldn't get at easily.
Excuse me, I don't think my question came through.
Okay.
By all means, I'm happy to.
It's from me on there. I typed it. I don't think it's coming through.
Brenda?
Everyone, yeah. Brenda.
Who am I addressing?
Brenda. But it just says me. I don't know. My name didn't come up.
I see Brenda
we
there
see
now.
Brenda there.
Yeah, this is very good, both content and delivery. Are you reading that on the side?
Sorry?
You don't get, I wrote.
I see.
The sidebar.
I see that. How does one overcome the influence of social media where youth are held captive?
Oh.
The question about, I'll address the question of the Legion first. The Jewish community contributed a great deal to the Second World War effort. And as you saw in that picture, the number of men, there were like 50 or 60 men who got their rings, and there were 2 from our community who never returned. Unfortunately, they died overseas. One of the Morris boys came home alive, but he died not too long after he returned from overseas. But after the Second World War, the majority of the Jews living in St. Catharines didn't participate in the Legion. They weren't really welcome in a lot of those social organizations. My dad became a Kiwanian. Harold Nash was a Rotarian. There were a number of them were Masons, but I don't think they participated in the Legion at all. Of course, they didn't serve overseas. By the time the next war came around, they were too old. So as far as social media, I'm attempting to use Facebook to get the word out about what the great things we are doing in our community, but that's new. That's not. No. I'm trying to learn those skills.
Well, you're just wanting to move the faith. You say how important the synagogue is going forward, but you have a youth that has all this other distraction, all this other busyness.
Well, that's the problem.
They don't put their phones down.
Beg your pardon?
They don't put their phones down.
No, they
with
don't
each other.
Well, it's our fault. We raised a generation to be citizens of the world, not citizens of the community. So many of them, our kids are, their horizons are not local, they're international. I have a daughter that lives in Minneapolis and a son that lives in Israel. I don't have anybody close to home, and most of my friends are the same way. I have a friend whose 2 sons are living in South Asia, and others they're all over the place. So it's the way of the world.
And yet it's your street and your community where you can have the most influence.
I'm sorry?
It's your street and your community where you, as an individual, can have the most influence.
That's right.
Is your community.
Okay.
Can't do much.
Okay, well, thank you again, Howard, and thank you for everyone for showing up to our second virtual presentation. We'll see everyone again, hopefully in March for the presentation there. And again, I encourage everyone to take out a membership. Again, for our current members or members last year and need to renew, you'll see that in the newsletter, or everyone else can just go to our website and you'll see the form there. And again, thanks everyone for coming out tonight, and thank you, Howard.
Thank you, my pleasure. And if you want to contact me, it's howard@slepkov.ca.
Bye, Howard.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Bye.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Anytime, come back.
Bye, Howard.
If I'm invited, I'll come back.
Okay.
Great lecture.
Well done. You'll rather be